Hi there, my name is Alex Shaminov, and this is Political Outline. And today we're going to talk a little bit about local politics and what the local political sphere looks like and how that translates to the broader political sphere within the United States, and how I believe ultimately that the way we fix many of the political issues that we have from the standpoint of national polarization are solved here on the local level. Now, for those of you watching, I live in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania has 67 counties, which have 67 county governments, and then from those county governments are comprised multiple municipalities. Where I live here in Lebanon County, Pennsylvania, there are approximately 7 or so local municipalities that make up the county regions. Each of these local municipalities are organized differently, but generally speaking, they represent the executive and legislative powers, or they comprise the executive and legislative powers for the municipalities. The counties then cover a larger surface. They also represent the executive and legislative powers, and then above that is the state. So in a previous video, I talked a little bit about how moralistic political ideology, that is judging other people's politics over moral issues, or specifically hot topic moral issues such as gun laws or abortion, for example, create problems within our country, because while these issues are incredibly important and need to be discussed under their own merits, ultimately when we look and perceive other people from the perspective of these moral issues, we are either deciding whether or not we believe they are a moral good or a moral bad slash evil, depending on whether or not they agree with our political opinion about these issues, political and or moral position. Now, the problem with these things is that while they're very important, when we stack them up in comparison to other issues, they ultimately affect a smaller grouping of people than some of the other issues that we discuss or look at, such as environmental policy, such as energy policy, such as infrastructure, such as domestic defense, such as international defense, such as healthcare, education, etc., which affect large swaths of the American population, or if not the entirety of the American population, whereas issues such as Second Amendment gun laws and or abortion, while they affect large swaths of the demographic population, ultimately, because people make political distinctions based on their own stances on these issues, effectively, many people will ignore policy proposals or beliefs for so many other political or policy areas, such as the ones I mentioned, specifically because of a person's stance on these issues. Again, I also talked in that video about how our political system is not necessarily conducive to people who have hybrid or mosaic views. Theoretically, considering the fact that we elect representatives, we should have pro-life Democrats and we should have pro-choice Republicans. We should have Republicans who believe in stricter gun laws, and we should have Democrats who believe in Second Amendment access. Unfortunately, because of the way our political system works, with us having a two-party system and our government is really designed in such a way that it can only house two political parties, effectively we alienate our ability to have a diversity of political perspectives and understandings. So considering that as a general problem, again, I'm covering some of these topics really quickly, so some of my definitions or discussions about the issues may be on the briefer end, and those things are ultimately going to have to be discussed in a future video. Obviously, issues such as abortion, Second Amendment, infrastructure, defense, environmentalism, energy policy, etc. These are all things that could have their own videos in the future. So please don't mistake my brief description of them or my brief coverage over them as my entire opinion of these pieces. But anyways, back to the topic of the video, that being how essentially I believe that the local level of politics is ultimately what allows us to heal in the face of these moral issues, is that every year or every other year, depending on the size of the state, in Pennsylvania, we have elections every year. In Pennsylvania, every other year is designated as a local election cycle. In one of these cycles, we predominantly will be electing things such as city councils, legislative representation, as well as mayors. And in another cycle, we will predominantly be electing county commissioners. Now, this kind of gets cut up in different ways depending on where you're at in the state and how your local municipality works. In general, though, in Pennsylvania, if we look at a 4-year election cycle, that being local, state slash national for Congress, being the House and then the Senate, and then local again, and then presidential slash national, we have a breakup each year that kind of distinguishes what we're voting for. Ultimately, every other year, we have elections that are, for the most part, entirely devoid of political battles that pertain to national politics. During our local cycles, for the most part, we're even completely removed from some of the state elections that dictate a lot of the that deal with some of the same national issues that our national legislature and or ultimately our executive slash president have to deal with. In this current election cycle, this is 2023, we're in the cycle of electing local legislators as well as county commissioners. We're also voting for some of our state judges, as well as some other state offices that aren't necessarily either our governor or our state legislators. Now, ultimately, it is my belief that local politics is the piece of our political system or our political establishment that allows us as people to heal from national political endeavors or national political partisanship and allow us to see and understand each other as the neighbors that we are. Ultimately, when we're electing local legislators such as city council people, township supervisors, etc., or county commissioners, we're not electing representatives that have any power over the hot topic national moral issues that typically divide us. Ultimately, it's through these elections that we have an ability to focus more on the actual policy issues which pertain to our everyday lives, as opposed to big, large issues that affect certain people a lot but don't necessarily affect the entire populace each and every day. In our local municipalities, our roads are something that affect us each and every day. Our local economies affect us each and every day. The safety of our schools and the quality of our schools affect us each and every day. Our tax systems affect us each and every day, and they affect us to a pretty great extent. Ultimately, the smaller the level of government that you're interacting with, the more that level of government interferes or interacts with your day-to-day life. Considering all of this, considering the fact that local elections are predominantly policy-based or day-to-day functionality-based, the types of issues that candidates running for these offices are meant to be focused on issues and solutions that pertain to the everyday. They don't have the ability to navigate or worry about these moral issues. Ultimately, while the ideology and philosophy, whereas government's concerned in terms of like the scope of government, is something that these political levels have to navigate. At the end of the day, that's really the most controversial issue that candidates have to worry about. They have to be able to represent their understanding and represent their understanding of government and present their ideals where government or interaction is considered. Ultimately, through these elections, we as voters, people within the community, have the ability to educate ourselves on the issues and needs of our communities. We're able to defocus from all of the national issues which make neighbors hate each other because they may very well be of different political perspectives or have different political perspectives, and focus more on the everyday functionality of our communities, right? It doesn't matter how two neighbors, excuse me, see, perceive, understand, or believe where abortion is concerned. At the end of the day, if they both have children that go to school, ultimately both of them have an equal investment into the safety and quality of our education spheres, of our public schools. Through the interaction with this government level, we're able to discuss and have political conversations with one another that are absolved from the moralistic disputes that are that we encounter when we discuss national politics, when we discuss state politics. Now, unfortunately, some states, because of their relatively small size, their elections are all smushed into one. Some states have elections every other year, in which case some of the state and national elections are brought into the political election sphere. And this makes it more challenging to be able to um, navigate some of these political conversations. Obviously and ultimately, there's a separation between what these people have the ability to do. It doesn't matter how many times a candidate for mayor comes to your door and tells you what their stance on abortion is, they have virtually zero impact or influence over this issue. It doesn't matter what a city council candidate's stance on the Second Amendment is, or what their stance on immigration is, or what their stance on any of the hot topic national issues are, because ultimately they have virtually no ability to influence or affect these issues. What they can influence and affect are things that exist within our everyday lives. If you travel through the same roads each and every day to work, ultimately the quality of those roads affect the quality of your everyday life. If you live in a city or a municipality with poor infrastructure, imagine if our bridges were not safe. Imagine if, while driving to and from the places that we need to get to from one day to the next, a bridge collapsed out from under us. This is an issue that threatens our individual everyday safeties and affect our communal lives, our lives together as a community. So ultimately, it doesn't matter what your stance on any of these other issues, wanting quality bridges is not a controversial issue. Wanting quality roads is not a controversial issue. Wanting a vibrant downtown is not a controversial issue. Now, some would say that issues pertaining to tax systems are controversial issues, of course, but if I believe that the government should not be spending any money hardly at all, and that taxes should be kept as low as humanly possible, if I come to you and I explain to a person, if I'm running for an office with that belief, and I explain to a person who I'm communicating with what my belief is and how that factors in economically, either the numbers add up, and usually local municipalities, the numbers are much smaller than they are on the national level. When we're talking about hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars, as is often discussed on the national level, it's very difficult to track the dollars. When we're talking about the governments on our local levels, it's much, much easier to track where the dollars are going and what it looks like from a reasonable perspective. Because we're able to maintain that on the local level, if I believe that the government should never be raising taxes under any circumstances, I can come to you as a potential candidate and say at your doorstep, effectively, as a neighbor, look, this is what I believe. This is what I intend to fight for, or this is what I intend to push for if I'm put into this office. And ultimately, this is how the numbers check out. And if they check out, they check out. And if they don't check out, ultimately the person who's listening to you is able to more reasonably and realistically discern for themselves whether they agree or believe what you're saying based on the facts that you're presenting them. Effectively, these local elections, this local political sphere, humanizes the process of politics because it's face to face, right? Oftentimes, when national candidates, when candidates for the U.S. House of Representatives, candidates for Senate, our governor candidates, our candidates for president, and even sometimes our candidates for state senate and state house, it's not necessarily feasible for them to go out and meet every person who lives within their jurisdiction, within their district sphere. But at the same time, local candidates have a much more feasible time of being able to accomplish that. You have a much higher probability of meeting some of your local representatives than you do your state or national representatives. Because that exists, these people have an ability to humanize the process of politics. Alternatively, they have the ability to do the exact opposite of that by making local politics politically contentious, by bringing in these broad national issues that they have no ability to actually affect to the local level, and effectively try to divide us for the interest of procuring political chips through an amalgamation of all of these little local seats. Obviously, one seat for on a board of township supervisors is not necessarily very powerful. But when you have all of them throughout a county sphere within multiple local governments, effectively you accumulate power that then you can use as leverage against people on other political levels. When we allow political parties and the political machine to come into our local municipalities and do this, effectively we allow them to steal the essence of politics from us, the human essence of politics, and we allow ourselves to never have a moment's room for breath. We allow ourselves to never be able to mend our relationships with one another because we allow our local political actors to bring in these controversial issues that are designed to divide us as individuals and make us believe that the person in front of us is either moral good or moral bad for no other purpose. Our purpose is then to gain political support. Now, this is a lot of information, right? Ultimately, if we allow national issues which divide us to creep in and seep into local levels which or which cannot be affected on these levels, nothing can be done about them on these levels, we effectively allow political ideologies to divide us constantly. We prevent ourselves from ever being able to see, perceive, recognize our neighbors as who and what they are, that being our neighbors, because we envision them or we see them as political adversaries. If we, however, systematically change that and start believing the idea that change is effectuated from the bottom up as opposed from the top down, usually we often believe that if we're going to accomplish anything, it has to happen at the very top of government and then trickle down. That's not really the case. Ultimately, the greatest amount of social change occurs on the local level because this is, again, where we can interact with each other on a one-on-one level. This is where we're able to mend relationships, build bridges, create consensus. Effectively, if we allow or if we create systems where our local levels can truly be local levels of politics that are focused on local issues, we're effectively able to completely reimagine the nature of politics within our country. Now, that may seem far off and distant when we think about all of the moving pieces, but realistically, there are more local governments, which we've already established have a more active role in our day-to-day lives than there are state and national governments. Now, of course, these state and national governments, they have so much more range of influence, but ultimately their ability to affect these individual issues is much less noticeable because it's spread out amongst millions, hundreds of thousands, if not millions or hundreds of millions of people. On the local level, many cities across the United States only have 10 to 30,000 people in them. That means that the government affects the lives of 10 to 30,000 people each and every single day. And the things that we're discussing, such as local economic development, affect our everyday lives so much more. They affect our taxes, they affect our school districts, they affect crime, they affect so many different factors that ultimately influence and design our day-to-day understanding of the world, or our day-to-day understanding of the political process, even more so. So ultimately, in conclusion, my main topic, my main idea in this video is essentially a challenge. It's a challenge to say in the United States we have a breakup within our election cycles for a reason. We have local cycles because the local cycle is very important, and we effectively just need a break from state and national politics. Let's start using that opportunity that we have to mend relationships or build relationships during these local cycles so that during national cycles or state cycles, we're able to understand each other more civilly. It's okay if you disagree. It's okay if you even disagree from a moral perspective, because to a certain extent, or at least in many times, it can be okay from a tolerance perspective to disagree with each other from a moral perspective, because the reason why you're disagreeing is not because you are a moral good or a moral bad, but because you have different perceptions of morality. Ultimately, if we take away this idea that we have a constant fight for good and evil, ultimately we're able to build consensus and realize, even though someone has a drastically different understanding than I do, their reasoning for them having that opinion is not because they're morally corrupted, but ultimately because they have a different moral perception. I'm not saying that this doesn't need to be addressed, but what I am saying is it needs to be addressed in a different way than we're currently addressing it. Our neighbors cannot be enemies, they cannot be villains, they cannot be evil. We have to be able to find consensus. So, with that all being said, I am going to end the video here. This is a lot of information to unpack. And like always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, if you want to ask me specifically more about what I mean about specific things, please reach out. And I hope to see you in the next one.